Interphobia or intersex phobia can be defined as negative beliefs, feelings, or attitudes towards people with variations of sex development or VSDs, also known as intersex. These negative beliefs, feelings, or attitudes can be prejudice, strong dislike, fear, stereotyping, othering, and so on. I can imagine that many of you must be scratching your heads over the title of this video, since the sex spectrum is always presented as something progressive and inclusive to people with VSDs. But you gotta remember that things aren't always what they are advertised. It's not uncommon to see ideas that aren't that great being promoted as good and progressive. That is the case, for example, with anti-vaccine among hippies and racial segregation in some American universities. Now, for those of you who are new to my channel, this isn't the first time that I talk about the sex spectrum here. In fact, the first time I did, I debunked a video by SciShow called "There are more than two human sexes." And looking back now, I admit that I should have been more sensitive with the way I approached the topic in that video. I gave too much emphasis to humor, and I think that was inappropriate in some instances. Not cool on my part, and I fully own up to that. My lack of tact, though, as regrettable as it was, doesn't change the fact that my debunking in that video was sound, and the so-called sex spectrum presented by SciShow is scientifically absurd. And if you still doubt me on that, let's look at an example. To demonstrate that sex is a spectrum and not binary, SciShow used this image.
The problem, of course, is the fact that from clothes to restrooms to organized sports, they are raised in a society that is set up around a binary that just isn't binary.
The problem with this argument is that these aren't sexes, they are karyotypes. These two things are related, but they are not the same. For example, many sexually reproducing species don't have what we call X and Y chromosomes, but they have what we call the male and female sexes. I thoroughly explained that on a different video, by the way, that I urge you to watch after this one if you haven't yet. Now, karyotyping is a system to determine the chromosomes of an organism. In humans, typically it's two X's or an X and a Y. But as this image correctly shows, there are variations, albeit rare. In species with X and Y chromosomes, like us, the rule is that only when an individual inherits a Y chromosome from their father, they will develop as male, which is why karyotyping is a very reliable way to identify sex. However, there are exceptions to the rule. A great example of that is XX males, which in medical literature is called de la Chapelle syndrome. Now, if you're paying attention, you must have realized that we found a major problem with SciShow's argument. If they are going to equate karyotypes with sexes,
they are raised in a society that is set up around a binary that just isn't binary.
XX males couldn't possibly be a thing, since the XX karyotype would be by definition on the female side of the spectrum. And supposing you acknowledge that XX males is a thing, which you should because they are, you should also acknowledge by logical consequence that karyotypes and sexes aren't the same thing, and that the sexes, female and male, must be defined by something else. And if karyotypes are not sexes, then variations in human karyotypes are not evidence of variations in human sexes. Therefore, this image proves jack shit. In order to defend this blunder, SciShow fans say that Hank Green never claimed that people with VSDs are of a third sex or more. But SciShow's video about VSDs is literally called "There are more than two human sexes." Now, if you are completely functionally illiterate, I can excuse your confusion, so let me explain it to you. When there is no question mark at the end of a sentence, that is an assertion. It's a claim. It's something that has to be proved, which SciShow didn't, as you've just seen. And by the way, that is only one of the many mistakes and leaps of logic SciShow did in that astoundingly embarrassing video. Like, if that video was a high school project, it deserved an F. But despite the numerous non-sequitur fallacies, jumps to conclusion, and complete lack of definition of essential terms like male and female, for example, a lot of people buy into SciShow's claims and similar claims made by others. But why do they? Why has it become so common for people to refuse to accept the fact that the human species has two and only two sexes. Well, I think there are very few people around capable of answering that question better than I can.
Get the fuck out of here.
And I don't say this out of arrogance. I say this because I used to believe in all of this sex spectrum stuff. And you don't have to just take my word for it. Here is a comment I left a couple of years ago in the video There Are Only Two Genders by Blair White. We are indeed a sexually dimorphic species, but we have not only two genders. That was only an assumption of modern biology that is now proven incorrect. In fact, non-binary genders and transgenderism are variations of gender with a strong foundation in biology. Differences in white matter microstructure on trans and non-binary people's brains compared to non-trans individuals. And gender is not merely a social construct either, it's mostly a biological construct that has been built over millions of years of evolution through natural selection. Some elements of gender roles and gender expression in humans are indeed social conventions though, names, fashion, jobs, activities, etc. And yeah, I know Blair did address that, I just wanted to reinforce. Intersex and chimerism are examples of how the chromosome argument is fallacious to defend the notion of only two biological sexes. The fact that chromosome variations among intersex people is not only possible but inherited do debunk the argument that only two chromosomes variations are genetically possible. Call it a defect as much as you like to try to dismiss it, but think about it. If only two variations were possible, there wouldn't be five. It's that obvious. Chimerism, on the other hand, occurs when one individual has different cells with two different DNAs, including cells with different pairs of chromosomes. Brain cells found in a cisgender woman's brains actually have XY chromosome. This also debunks not only the notion that one individual can only have one genotype, but also that one person cannot be both biologically male and female at the same time. Ignoring the fact that Blair White is conflating sex with gender, the most fascinating thing about my comments is that every single thing that I claim is factual, and I provided evidence to confirm my claims. But similar to SciShow and others, my mistake there was the interpretation of the facts and what they actually mean. For example, as you've just seen, variations in karyotypes is not evidence of variations in human sex, because karyotypes aren't sexes. My problem there is that I actually didn't know very basic concepts of biology, like male and female, for example. But I thought I knew because that's so basic, right? But that is one of the main reasons why people buy into this whole sex spectrum stuff, because they are convinced that they know what male and female means in biology, but they actually don't. You see, I was where most people are, especially YouTubers and Twitter users, sitting comfortably, a top-mount stupid. I was the queen of biology, and whenever, wherever somebody would say that sex is binary, I would just instantly reply, what about intersex people? Bang, done, argument debunked, the sex binary is smashed again. But after getting my ass kicked over some very basic concepts by IRL biologists, who by the way should not be confused with social media biologists, I had to be honest with myself and admit that I was just a fucking noob. And the truth is that one does not simply abandon the comforts of Mount Stupid and roams into the valley of despair. One has to be dragged down, kicking and screaming, and then have the guts to admit to themselves that sometimes, most of the time actually, they have to shut the fuck up, listen, read, and learn more. And you know what? That's exactly what I did. I learned more. And that's why I changed my mind and realized that referring to sex as a spectrum is a type of category mistake, a result of not fully comprehending what the terms male and female really mean in biology. But that wasn't all I learned during this time. After making countless Twitter threads and videos about this, I learned something else, that focusing on the science and trying to explain these technical concepts is not an effective way to change people's minds. One thing I noticed over and over again is that that even after being corrected by RLL biologists over basic concepts like male and female, some people still refuse to admit that they made a mistake or that they don't know such basic concepts. In part, I think it's just pride that nobody wants to admit, publicly at least, that they don't know something that we all assume is so basic and simple, which is not anybody's fault except the fucking education system that failed most of us. But that is not the main reason. The main reason is that to most people who fiercely defend the sex spectrum, this isn't really a debate about science, about philosophy of biology. This is a moral debate. And when people are absolutely convinced that their belief makes them a good person, appeals to logic, to facts, to IRL experts, it's not going to change their mind. Which is why in this video, I don't want to focus so much on the science and the technical aspects of this debate, even though I cannot completely avoid the science due to the very nature of the topic. But this time around, my main focus is the morality of the sex spectrum. I want to help you understand why so many people, possibly yourself included, are so keen to defend this idea and refuse to see the interphobic ramifications of it. Earlier, we saw how SciShow's argument that sex is a spectrum doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. So let's look at a more sophisticated example, this time from Scientific American. Looking at the title, we can already see the same problem from SciShow's example, the mistake of equating karyotypes with sexes. If you define female and male as XX and XY respectively, then of course, variations in karyotypes would mean variations in human sexes. But as you've seen before, that's not the case. One's karyotype is a great indicator of their sex, but it's not how we define sex. The text that follows the title says how sex determination is a very complicated process, which is absolutely true. And it's also true that from that complexity, cases of ambiguity in sex characteristics do occur. But it's when we get to the actual spectrum that things get really problematic. Scientific American is not defining male and female as reproductive categories, but instead as composites of masculine or feminine sex characteristics, respectively. According to their spectrum, a full male is a person who has all the typical human male characteristics: XY chromosomes, a thick beard, muscly and mildly dangly naughty bits, testosterone dripping out of their pores. Think of Burt Reynolds.
Stunning. Like a young Burt Reynolds.
And also, according to Scientific American, if you happen to be born with Klinefelter syndrome, for example, meaning you have all the male naughty bits but low testosterone, little facial hair, and possibly man tits, you are less male than those Burt Reynolds types. You see, this is the result of scientists playing with the sex spectrum. This was only an abstract idea in Uber avant-garde gender studies department. There was really no concern over how the sex spectrum would be applicable as a model to classify human sex. Because models are useful things, and philosophers don't waste their time with anything that is remotely useful. But scientists are entirely different animals. The main job of a scientist is to create models of reality that help making the natural world explicable and intelligible. And they do so mostly by observing patterns. So when male and female are redefined as composites of sex characteristics, those who will be classified as male will be all who have the typical male characteristics, and those classified as female will be all who have typical female characteristics. But when a person happens to develop mostly characteristics that are typically male, but a few characteristics that are typically female, that person will be less male than typical males in a spectrum of male and femaleness. That is the sex spectrum, according to Scientific American. Now be honest with yourself. Do you really think that it's progressive to redefine being biologically male as conforming to a stereotype of masculine body? Personally, I don't think so. I think this reminds me of very conservative and backwards ideas of what male and femaleness consists of. In this case, simply repackaged and marketed as progressive to gullible readers. And since we were talking about Klinefelter syndrome, honestly, I would wager money on the fact that the overwhelming majority of people with Klinefelters wouldn't appreciate the idea that their condition makes them less male than their typical male peers. I think they would resent that notion very much. Well, but all things considered, at least Scientific American gave us an attempt of a model of a sex spectrum. However, they didn't really explain how this model even works. I mean, looking at it, it's not only very confusing, but it all seems rather arbitrary. For example, why are people with congenital vaginal hyperplasia less female than those with testicular disorder or sex development? Is there a point system? Does having XY chromosomes gives you 50 male points, but having an uterus gives you like 20 female points? I don't know. And in fact, Scientific American gives no explanation whatsoever. In fact, nobody that defends this idea has ever given any explanation of how we turn this into an applicable model in reality and how it could replace the classification of sex based on reproductive role and better explain the role of sexual reproduction in evolution. Nobody has neither been able to explain to me how the sex spectrum model actually improves the lives of people with VSDs. In fact, in certain cases like Klinefelter's, as we've seen, I think teaching this model in schools would make their lives worse by effectively othering them for not fitting a stereotype. But you know, even pointing out these moral and practical shortcomings of the sex spectrum might not be enough to convince some people of its flaws. Because to them, the sex spectrum is the only alternative they have to the idea of sex as a binary, and that is their real concern. Anti-binarism is a fundamental moral imperative of contemporary critical theory and post-structuralist philosophies, which nowadays are the predominant philosophies in most social sciences and humanities departments in universities. People who believe in these ideas are convinced that binary concepts are bad and they must be deconstructed. And many successful academic careers were built and are maintained by preaching this gospel. But listen, and some of you might not like to hear this, some things are binaries independently of what your pet philosophers might say. For example, human bodies can only produce 2 types of sex cells, have only 2 types of sex chromosomes, and have only 2 reproductive roles, which makes all of these things binaries, as in 2. And that is a fact. And if you believe in science, you have to acknowledge and accept this fact, or present evidence that make them false, like showing a 3rd type of sex cell in humans, for example. Curiously though, most people I've talked to who defend the sex spectrum do acknowledge these facts, but they say they are redefining the terms male, female, and sex in order to, according to them, be more inclusive to people with VSD. Now, never mind the fact that I have never seen any clear definition of any of these terms in any video or article about the sex spectrum, but the concept of VSDs only makes sense if you understand sex characteristics as being either male or female, because we say someone is intersex when they have both male and female sex characteristics. But the million-dollar question is, how do we determine which characteristics are male and which characteristics are female? Now, I do explain that thoroughly in the video that I recommended to you earlier, which you should watch. So I'll give a much abbreviated explanation here. When female and male are defined as reproductive categories, it becomes very clear that sex characteristics are a byproduct of evolution through natural selection, and that they have evolved to support individual organisms to fulfill a reproductive role. We say the penis is a male sex organ because its primary function is to deliver sperm inside the female, and the ovaries are female sex organs because their primary function is to produce eggs. And that way we can say that a person who develops a penis and ovarian tissue is intersex. But in order to be able to say that, the sex categories have to be established first according to reproductive role. If you don't define sex this way, there is no way to reliably establish sex characteristics as being male or female, which would effectively render the term intersex unintelligible. But of course, if you define sex this way, that means that the human species have only 2 sexes, which makes sex a binary. Unless you want to argue that the human species is not gonochoristic. An intersex is a 3rd reproductive role synonym to hermaphrodite, which, by the way, is a term historically used to denigrate people with VSD, so I would strongly advise you against doing that. Okay, so in abstract terms, in the model, sex is binary. But here is the $2 million question, and the one that I get in every video or Twitter thread that I make about this. What if a person is born with both testicular and ovarian tissue? Is that person male or female? Now, the technical term in biology for an organism that fulfills both male and female reproductive function is hermaphrodite, which again is a slur against intersex people, so please don't use it. And technically speaking, there are no human hermaphrodites, even though these cases are indeed often referred to as hermaphroditism or pseudo-hermaphroditism in medical reports, which is something that many intersex rights organizations is trying to change, by the way. Now, that was all very useful information, but our problem persists. How should we call these individuals? Male or female? Here is my solution. Listen carefully. Call them however they want to be called. Simple, right?
Makes sense.
And if a person born with such condition really want to know whether they are technically male or female, they should talk to their doctor and do a DNA test to find out. But that is a private matter. And this is the main thing that I want to talk about in this video. As I explained earlier, the fact that there are people with ambiguous sex characteristics doesn't mean that there are more than two sexes in people, or that such individuals are less male or female than typical endosex people. In biology, sex is defined according to reproductive roles, which in humans there are only two. And unless you want to argue that humans are not a gonochoristic species, calling sex a spectrum is a category mistake, since in gonochorism the reproductive roles are dichotomous. And if you want to argue that humans are not gonochoristic, then you are arguing that intersex people are hermaphrodites, which again I advise you against. Now look, I know it's tempting to use people with VSDs as examples to own ignorant TERFs on Twitter when they say dumb shit like only women have uteruses, for example. Because yes, it can be very satisfying to see a TERF backtrack when you mention a VSD to expose their ignorance. But when you use people with VSDs as sort of gotchas in these discussions, you are making them no more than scientific curiosities. And some might say turning them into props for your agenda. And that is totally not cool. You see, when TERFs make these generalizing statements that they really like doing, they are the ones being hurtful to people with VSDs. And that's what you should point out. Maybe just say something like, some men do have uterus, you f***ing ignorant.
That escalated quickly.
It jumped up a notch.
It did, didn't it?
Well, just note that calling people on Twitter might get you banned, but it feels pretty good. Also, when people bring particular VSDs as gotchas, debates tend to go to really bad places. For example, people debating whether someone with 5-alpha reductase deficiency or complete androgenic sensitivity syndrome are male or female. This kind of shit is something that happens really often in social media. And it's hard to not see yourself embroiled in these discussions when they are happening online, and I have been guilty of taking part in them. But that is not the kind of argument that people should be having on social media. To stick with the example, people with complete androgen sensitivity syndrome are, for all purposes except reproduction, female, and they should be addressed as female. Well, except in case they identify as non-binary or as male, then they should be addressed according to their preference. How science would classify them is not really relevant except in a science class. So I urge you to please stop using people with VSDs to make a point about sex classification. I urge you to stop using people with VSDs as scientific curiosities in discussions about gender. I urge you to stop spreading the false notion that anyone who never had a DNA test could easily be intersex. Sex ambiguity in humans is extremely rare, and in fact most conditions classified as VSDs do not present sex ambiguity at all. Also, these conditions often require medical care and result in infertility. So I do find quite insensitive to people with VSDs when endosex proponents of the sex spectrum try to trivialize their conditions. But the thing that I find most shocking about all of this is that most arguments in social media about sex spectrum aren't even about people with VSDs. Most arguments involve transgender people in one way or another. In fact, the two things, being transgender and being intersex, are often conflated, with transgender issues, of course, gaining much more visibility. This isn't in any way helpful to people with VSDs. The sex spectrum is often used as a tool to own the turfs on Twitter, which is why there is such a strong belief among progressive people that in order to be on the good side of history and defend intersex and transgender rights, you must defend the sex spectrum. But that is a lie. Because you see, I, for example, support affirmative care for transgender people. I support the right for transgender and sex or intersex people to change their sex in their birth certificate if they want to. And I think that doctors who perform unnecessary surgery in intersex children should face legal consequences. I also defend that someone's biological sex is not an information that is useful to have in an identification document. What matters for identification is a person's legal sex, which may or may not be aligned with their biological sex. That's what I call gender, by the way, but that's a topic for a different video. But of course, many of you will still call me a bigot and paint me as a villain because I don't support your spectrum model of sex, despite the fact that when it comes to policies, everything that I defend is progressive. You see, internet activism made many of you forget what activism is all about. It isn't about supporting some theory, some 4i point text that cooked up after jerking off to Michel Foucault's oeuvre in some Ivy League library. It's about supporting policies and laws that make people's lives better. That's activism. Well, and then there is also the fact that the sex spectrum fails on all levels. On a scientific level, it points people away from understanding sex differentiation on an evolutionary perspective. And biology is the science of evolution, so supporting it is a disservice to science. And on the moral level, the sex spectrum defines sex as stereotypes of male and femaleness. So to support it is to effectively other anyone who doesn't fit such stereotypes. And to those of you who will attack me for this video, let me just say this. I have probably thought about this topic way more than any of you have. And the more I think about the sex spectrum and understand it, the stronger is my rejection of it. And I cannot express support for something that I know is wrong. That goes against my principles. And I know that publicly expressing my views on this topic costs me a lot of social capital with the progressive crowd online. And honestly, I really have no reason to do it. I could just simply not talk about it at all. But I choose to talk about it because I care about what's right, I care about science, and I care about people with VSDs. A tiny minority that, in my opinion, is being thrown under the bus by my progressive peers. So I will not betray my principles to win brownie points with mainstream progressives on social media, no matter how many insults and slurs are thrown at me by their fans. And you know what? If I have faith into something, is that the facts and logic always prevail, sooner or later. So it's my belief that when future generations see that there were people in this day and age who defended that sex is a spectrum, they will just cringe. The same way that I cringe when I see it. Well, thank you all for watching. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more content. And as always, a big thank you to all of my subscribers and a massive ultra thank you to all of my lovely patrons. And I've been Michel, and I'll see you next time.